Hi guys, you join me live today in this Jaguar X300. First of all, we're filming live in virtual reality on a 360 degree camera, so you can move the view that you see. If you're on a computer, use your mouse. If you're on a smartphone or a tablet, you can either slide your finger across the screen or you can move your device. And hopefully if you do that, you'll be able to move your view from the back headrest here, and hopefully you'll be able to see me and you'll be able to see the dashboard on this car. So very warm welcome. The car we got here is very special. This is a car that I inherited some years ago from a very close family friend back in about 2008, and I've hardly driven the car since then. This Jaguar is a 1997 car. It's an XJ Sport from the X300 series, so car from 1997, and this was a car that was owned, as I say, by a very close family friend who very kindly left it to me. But unfortunately I haven't really given it a great deal of use over the past few years because for one reason or another I've not really needed a large Jaguar saloon. So initially I kept the car in a museum, and it was there for many years, and since then it's been kept in garages, and I drove the car I think once to the museum back in 2008, and I haven't really driven the car since then. So it's really exciting to finally be able to get behind the wheel here in 2019, over 20 years since this car was built. Now this version, the X300, was the first car that Jaguar manufactured and developed under Ford ownership, and it was a really important car for Jaguar. The brand has always been known for its very attractive styling, but during the 80s Jaguar didn't have a particularly good name for reliability, and they'd have problems with electrics, they'd have problems with mechanics, and that was something that under Ford ownership the brand was determined to overcome. And it's something that they really achieved with this car. Ford decided that the car would be built by Japanese robotics, built by Nissan, and they invested £100 million into state-of-the-art manufacturing facilities in Browns Lane, and this was the last Jaguar to be built in Coventry at the Browns Lane plant before they moved to their existing Castle Bromwich factory. So a lot of time went into both the development and sorting out the manufacture process. The car was fully designed with computer-aided design, which was quite advanced back in the late 80s, early 90s when this car was developed, and they were determined that the quality would be spot on. So they started practicing the build on a separate production line many months before production actually started with the launch of the car. They paid great attention to former points of weakness, so the bodywork. I think there are about 10 coats of paint on these cars to ensure they don't corrode, and they have got a good reputation. And the car we're in now has absolutely no corrosion on at all. It's a really pristine body, but also the door seals were made to really exacting standards, and if you close the doors on these, they almost feel like a German car. Really well built. Electronics, another thing that Jaguar didn't have a great reputation for, so all of the key connections are gold plated to ensure reliability, and on this car everything works. On a British car 22 years after manufacture, it's really quite a feat. Everything works. The only thing that doesn't work is the digital clock, and those were notorious on these cars. The LCD panel wasn't very good, and they failed within a few years of manufacture. And on this, true to form, you can see I don't have a digital clock. But who needs a digital clock when you've got such a beautiful example of British quality, really, and such an iconic car? This version was very closely based on the XJ40 generation, which had been around in the 80s. But Jaguar wanted to go for not only a more reliable car, but also a more attractive car. And on both counts, they succeeded. This car was very reliable. the new engine, the AJ6, is known to be bulletproof, and the later examples of this car with V8s are known to be inferior in terms of reliability. Really good mechanicals on this car. The interior is quite similar to the XJ40, so if you're familiar with those cars, you will recognise certain aspects of the interior, of the dashboard, even of the instrument binnacle. But there has been evolutionary change. But where they really undertook a lot of work was the exterior styling. This car has a beautiful silhouette. When it was launched, it was awarded by the Italian car magazines the title of the most beautiful car in the world. And I think that for a four-door executive saloon, it undoubtedly was. If we think of what was contemporaneous with this car back in 1994 when it launched, that would have been things like the very boxy Mercedes S-Class, the 7 Series from the era. Now, if you look at any of those cars now, they look very dated, they look very, very boxy, they look very 80s, very 90s, whereas this car with its flowing curves still looks really beautiful even today in 2019. And if you look ahead of me, you can see we've got a beautifully sculpted bonnet. It really is very beautiful. And if you look at both the front and the rear, they taper. The design is really unique. There isn't another car that looked like it then, and there isn't another car that looks like it now. For a four-door luxury saloon, it has a very artistic, very aesthetic appearance. It's not a three-box design. It's very elegant. It's very sleek. However, beauty, as they say, isn't pain-free, and that's true on this XJ. Although Jaguar did do a great job on the reliability, there are a few practical prices that you pay for such a beautiful shape. The first is the car is very low to the ground. Now that really enhances the road holding, and it makes it feel very sporty, and even today it feels very sporty. The steering is very sharp, the body feels very well controlled. It actually feels quite a small car, although it's very large. It feels very manageable. It doesn't feel as long as it is, and in terms of the width, it actually feels quite a narrow car. You feel very cocooned in this cabin with the way the dashboard comes out, the way you've got this raised central console, the way the gear selector is raised towards my hand on this iconic J-gate automatic transmission. You feel cocooned, it feels very sporty, so that's a plus. However, you will note when you try to get into it that, for example, it has very high sills. So it's not really great for elderly people, and of course a lot of these probably were bought by pensioners, by company directors, so it may have taken a little bit of time for them to get their leg out over the sills, which are elevated, and of course you're already very low to the ground. In addition, it's very, very comfortable up here in the front. However, in the back it is quite cramped, and this is a limousine, so for a limousine to be cramped in the back is a sin that not many cars would manage to be forgiven. But the beautiful Jaguar XJ6 of course managed to. This was the car of prime ministers, this was the car of celebrities, of royalty. Anyone has been chauffeured in one of these, but the true reality is the front is where you want to be. It's a little bit cramped in the back. The other thing is the heights are quite low to keep the dimensions. The body, it's very low to the ground. The bonnet is very sleek, very low, as is the boot. So to maintain proportions, they couldn't build the roof too high, and that means that it's not the tallest car in the world, and you do sit quite low within it. At the front, it feels quite nice, quite a nice height, but in the back, you do feel unusually low for a car of this sort. It feels quite sporting, I suppose, is the upside, but the downside is, for a luxury car, and then of course we've got one of its ancestors. This really is a thoroughbred. So I said before, anyone who was anyone has been chauffeured in one of these. So who has been? Well, Her Majesty the Queen visited the Browns Lane factory in, I think it was 1995. It was only her second visit to Jaguar since the 1950s, and she ordered one of these, albeit in the Daimler specification. So she had one, and this was a car that she would herself drive. Hers was green. So good enough for the Queen, certainly good enough for you and me. In addition, the Prime Ministers, I think the first Prime Minister to be driven in one of these was Tony Blair. They were out for John Major. Margaret Thatcher would have certainly been driven around in the XJ40, the car that came before, that had quite a similar cabin. John Major, although he would have been in power, it usually takes a little bit of time for them to adapt them for prime ministerial use, and I don't recall seeing him in one, but certainly Tony Blair, the car that took him to power, was an X300. Even his successors, Gordon Brown, famously was driven around in one of these. Only really with David Cameron did they move to the newer vehicle, the Ian Callum design that we have today. Celebrities, they've all had them, and it's even had a number of Hollywood performances. So even as late as James Bond, the one after Casino Royale, the name's slipping my mind, but the villain Dominic Green, when they're at the Opera House, the car that he's driven in Austria, it's one of these, which is amazing. And I think that film was back in 2008 or thereabouts. So even then, it was considered, despite being a car that was well over 10 years old, that was good enough for a Bond villain. If it's good enough for a Bond villain, then it's certainly in the vein of Jaguar's adage, it's good to be bad. That villains in the 60s always chose a Jag. So what's it like to drive in 2019? It's quite a nice experience. It doesn't feel a modern car. You do feel that you're in something that is more akin to a classic car. It feels from another era, but it feels very charming in the way that it drives. The steering feels very direct in a way that modern electrically assisted power steering cars do not. The size feels again more of a bygone era, and it really is quite lovely, really. But because it's not that old, it feels usable, it feels practical, it feels that it has sufficient pace to keep up, it feels it has sufficiently contemporaneous styling to still look good, to still draw attention, and it's very, very comfortable, very refined. It's so quiet, the engine, it really is effortless progress. It really does feel like a prestige car, very, very fun. The steering is very light, although it's very direct, and there is very good response. It's very nicely assisted. Only very minimal efforts are actually needed to change course in this car, so you do feel very calm driving it. The size, it feels a nice size. Modern cars have grown, and sometimes they can feel a little bit cumbersome. This doesn't. It feels a good size. And the suspension, boy, did they do a good job with that. It is sharp and dynamic, but it's also really comfortable. I think this car had a special suspension system. I think it had a independent rear setup. Very good balance that they've obtained. But it's not a German car. You really feel that this is not a German car. This is something different. There is perhaps a gentleness that you just don't get from Audi, Mercedes or BMW, it has a personality. It feels more polite, very, very English, and the cabin is just, there's a lovely ambience. It is of course a few years old, but I still think it looks quite classy. The instruments are very clear. They're quite unusual in that we've got not only a revometer, for the revs and the speedometer, but we've also got 4 other gauges. We've got the battery, we've got the fuel tank, we've got the oil pressure, and we've got the temperature. It's really nice to be able to have that. On new cars, you're losing a lot of these features, particularly the temperature gauge, and the oil and the battery are all but unheard of.